First story. The thing in the woods. I don't go camping anymore. Not after what happened that night in Black Hollow Forest. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway with my two best friends, Jake and Eric. We packed light, brought plenty of beer, and set up camp in a clearing deep in the woods, far from any trails. The first day was fine, laughing, fishing, and roasting marshmallows over the fire. But when night fell, something felt off. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just dead silence. And then, the noises started. At first it was distant, snapping twigs, the shuffle of footsteps. We joked that it was a bear, but deep down, none of us believed that. Bears don't mimic voices. At around midnight, just as we were settling into our tents, we heard it. Help! Me! The voice was distant, but getting closer. It sounded like a child. A child alone in the middle of nowhere. My skin went ice cold. Jake grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Hello? Are you lost? He called. Silence. Then suddenly, help me! Right behind us! I spun around, but there was nothing. Just trees and darkness. My heart pounded. Then something moved. A tall, distorted figure stood just outside the firelight, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It swayed like it was studying us. Then it screamed. Not a human scream. Something deep, guttural, like a dying animal. The fire flickered as if the air itself recoiled. We bolted for the car. The thing gave chase, crashing through the underbrush. Jake tripped. I turned just in time to see something, long clawed fingers, wrap around his ankle and drag him into the darkness. His screams still haunt me. Eric and I made it to the car and sped off, calling the police. They searched for days but never found a single trace of Jake. No footprints, no blood. It was like he had never been there at all. But I know what I saw, and I will never, ever go back. 2 years later, I got a message. An unknown number. A video attachment. Shaky, dark footage. Someone, something, was holding the camera. Heavy breathing. Then the camera panned to a familiar face. Jake. His eyes were wide, filled with terror. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Behind him, shadows twisted unnaturally, forming jagged, clawed appendages. Then the screen glitched. The last frame? A pair of glowing eyes staring directly into the lens. The video vanished from my phone the second I tried to show someone. Now at night I hear whispers outside my window. Help me. Second story is the Hollow Watcher. I never liked camping. My wife Sarah convinced me it would be a great way to unplug, and our son Jamie was thrilled. I gave in. We packed up our SUV and drove deep into Black Hollow Forest, a place Sarah had visited as a child. The woods were dense, ancient, the kind that swallowed sound. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong quiet. The further we hiked, the more the silence pressed against us. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots on the damp earth. Jamie ran ahead, laughing. Look, Dad, a deer! He pointed through the trees. I followed his gaze. It wasn't a deer. At first I thought it was a tree, twisted and thin. But then it moved. Its body was too long, limbs stretched unnaturally, fingers tipped with dark, claw-like nails. Its face, if you could call it that, was smooth, featureless, except for two hollow, sunken pits where eyes should have been. And it was watching us. Jamie, get back here. My voice was firm, but inside, ice crept through my veins. The thing cocked its head. Then, in a voice identical to mine, it said, Jamie, get back here. Jamie hesitated. I grabbed him, yanking him behind me. The thing shifted forward, its impossibly long arms hanging limply at its sides. Sarah gasped. What the hell is that? We're leaving. Now. We stumbled back to our campsite, shoving things into our packs. I felt it out there, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. Then came the whispering, not one voice, many, dozens. They weaved through the trees, murmuring in tones we recognized. My father's voice, dead for years, my mother's lullaby. A teacher I hadn't seen since childhood. Jamie clung to Sarah. Mom, I don't like this. Neither do I, baby. A branch snapped. I turned, flashlight trembling. Shadows twisted between the trees, stretching long and distorted. The whispers grew louder. Then the thing stepped into the firelight. It had changed. It looked like me. Same height, same clothes. But the face, God, the face, was still wrong. The skin was stretched too tight, the mouth a black gash that twitched as if trying to form words. It raised a finger, long and gnarled, and pointed at Jamie. Something primal took over. I grabbed a burning log from the fire and hurled it. The creature recoiled with an inhuman screech, the sound drilling into my skull. I didn't wait. I grabbed Sarah's hand, hoisted Jamie onto my back, and ran. The trees blurred. The whispering followed, voices shifting, calling out in desperate, familiar tones. Then, Sarah screamed. I turned to see her trip, tumbling down a short slope. The thing was right behind her, its mouth yawning open, revealing jagged, needled teeth. I grabbed Sarah, yanking her up. The thing's fingers brushed my arm. It was cold, like something long buried in the earth. We burst onto the dirt road where our SUV was parked. I didn't look back. I threw Jamie inside, Sarah scrambled in, and I slammed the door shut. Something hit the car, hard enough to rattle the frame. I turned the key. The engine sputtered. Come on, come on! The whispering was inside the car now, curling around us. Then, the engine roared to life. I floored it. The thing stood in the rearview mirror, watching as we sped away. Its body twisted, bones cracking, mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. And then it whispered, in my voice, "See you soon." Third story dragged into the dark. I still don't know what happened that night. There were 5 of us. Me, Jake, Olivia, Marcus, and Ben. We had planned this trip for months, a weekend of camping in Ravenwood Forest, a place rumored to be haunted. We laughed at the stories, people disappearing, strange whispers in the trees, but that was part of the thrill. The first night, we set up camp near a clearing. The trees stood tall and unyielding, their branches tangled like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with damp earth and pine. As we lit the fire, Olivia shivered, murmuring that it felt weird, like we weren't alone. Marcus chuckled, saying that was the point, scary stories and all that. I wanted to agree, but something felt off. The silence was too heavy. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the occasional snap of a twig somewhere deep in the trees. That first night we told ghost stories, trying to scare each other. But the real fear started when the fire burned low. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked, then another, footsteps, slow, deliberate. We froze, listening. Jake held up a finger to his lips and whispered that it was probably just an animal, but no animal walks on 2 legs. The footsteps stopped. A long silence followed. Then, from the darkness, came a sound, low and guttural, like something breathing. Ben laughed nervously, asking who was messing with us. No one answered. Then, the whispering began. It came from all around us, soft voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The words were unintelligible, just a murmur carried by the wind. Marcus stood up, shining his flashlight into the trees. Nothing. The light barely cut through the thick blackness. I swallowed hard and suggested we get some sleep. We crawled into our tents, but none of us truly slept. I lay awake for hours, heart pounding, listening. The whispers faded, but the unease remained. Morning came too slowly. We emerged from our tents, exhausted. Olivia looked pale, dark circles under her eyes. She whispered that she heard something. Someone walking around the tents last night. None of us wanted to admit we heard it too. Then we noticed Ben's tent was open. His sleeping bag was empty. At first, we thought he'd gone to relieve himself, but minutes stretched into an hour. Jake called into the woods. Silence. We searched the area, our voices growing frantic. No sign of him, no footprints, just gone. Panic set in. We debated leaving, but our cars were a 2-hour hike away, and splitting up seemed worse. Marcus said we should wait, that maybe Ben had just wandered off. That night, the fear grew. We sat close to the fire, barely speaking. Every snap of a twig sent us whipping our heads around. Then Olivia screamed. She pointed toward the trees, saying she saw something, a face. I swung my flashlight toward the darkness. Nothing. But the trees felt closer somehow, as if the forest itself was shifting. Then the whispering returned. Closer this time, circling us. I clenched my fists and said we needed to leave first thing in the morning. Everyone nodded, but it was already too late. In the dead of night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking. The tent zipper was down, half open. I knew I had closed it. Then a whisper, right outside. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I peered out. A figure stood at the edge of the firelight. It was Ben, but something was wrong. He was facing away, his body rigid. His clothes were dirty, torn. His head tilted slightly as if listening. I whispered his name. He turned slowly. His face was all wrong. His mouth stretched too wide, his eyes vacant. A sickly grin spread across his lips. I recoiled, scrambling backward. Then he moved. Not walked, glided, his limbs jerking like a marionette. I screamed. The others woke in a panic. Jake grabbed a lantern, shining it on Ben, but he was gone. The forest had swallowed him whole. No one slept. We sat around the fire, gripping whatever makeshift weapons we could find. Then Marcus vanished. 1 second he was there, gripping a knife, eyes wild with fear. The next, just gone, like the night had swallowed him. We ran, branches whipped at my face. The whispering was deafening now, voices blending, frantic. My flashlight flickered. Shapes moved between the trees, watching. I felt them. Olivia tripped. I grabbed her arm, pulling her up. Jake turned to me, breath ragged. He said they were taking us one by one. I didn't argue. Then, we saw it. A clearing. A massive gnarled tree in the center. And beneath it, Marcus and Ben, hanging. Suspended in the air like marionettes, their eyes wide, mouths stretched in silent screams. Olivia sobbed. Then their heads snapped toward us. Their mouths moved, but their voices weren't theirs. Stay! Jake grabbed my arm and yelled for us to run. We sprinted. The forest closed in, the trees shifting, twisting. The whispering screamed. And then, the ground vanished beneath me. I fell, tumbling into darkness. When I woke, it was dawn. I was alone. The forest was silent. The campsite was gone. No signs of struggle, no footprints. Nothing. Only my flashlight remained, flickering weakly beside me. Jake and Olivia were gone. I stumbled toward the trail, legs weak. Somehow, I made it back to the car. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, the only sound in the deafening silence. As I pulled away, I dared to look in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw them. Ben, Marcus, Jake, Olivia. Standing at the edge of the trees, watching. Their mouths stretched into smiles. And then they whispered, in voices not their own. See you soon. I never told anyone what happened. The police found nothing, no bodies, no signs of struggle, just an empty campsite. But I know the truth. The forest took them. And some nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear their whispers, calling me back. The last story is the smiling man. I never should have gone alone. That thought kept repeating in my mind as I trudged through the dense forest, the trail fading into an unfamiliar maze of trees and shadows. The Appalachian woods had always been a haven for me, a place to disconnect from the chaos of the world. But tonight, they felt different, hostile, almost sentient in their silence. I had set up camp before dusk, finding a clearing deep in the woods far from any other hikers. I wanted solitude, a chance to clear my head. I had built my fire, cooked a small meal, and settled in, the crackling flames offering a false sense of security. The forest had been quiet, too quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Then, I saw him. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. A figure stood at the edge of the firelight, partially obscured by the trees. His posture was unnervingly still, his face barely visible in the flickering glow. But what I could see chilled me to my core, his smile. It was too wide, stretching across his face like something inhuman. His teeth, stark white against the darkness, gleamed in the fire's light. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared, that awful grin frozen in place. My blood turned to ice. Hello? My voice barely rose above a whisper, but the figure remained silent. A part of me wanted to believe he was just another camper. Lost, maybe. But my gut told me otherwise. Then he took a step forward. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to listen. I was frozen, gripped by a terror so raw it felt like my limbs had turned to stone. He took another step, his movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring my fear. The fire flickered, casting long, shifting shadows that made his features seem to twist and distort. I forced myself to act. With shaking hands, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it directly at him. He was gone. I swung the light wildly, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just darkness and the skeletal arms of the trees swaying in the wind that had suddenly picked up. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired. But deep down, I knew better. I barely slept that night, jumping at every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind. The fire burned low, flickering weakly, but I didn't dare let it die out completely. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that awful grin. And every time I opened them again, I swore I heard faint, muffled laughter drifting through the trees. It was distant at first, almost blending with the wind, but each time I dozed off, it seemed closer, more insidious, like something breathing just beyond the veil of darkness. When dawn finally broke, I packed up camp in record time, eager to leave the eerie solitude behind. The morning mist clung to the ground like a ghostly veil, swirling around my boots as I hiked back toward the main trail. My nerves were raw, every snap of a twig setting my pulse racing. But I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched clung to me as I trekked back toward the main trail. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of movement between the trees, a shadow darting just out of sight, the snap of a branch that wasn't mine. Then, ahead of me on the trail, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. But they weren't mine. They were fresh, deep in the damp earth, leading toward my campsite before turning back in my direction. Someone had been following me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The sun was beginning to set again, casting long skeletal shadows through the trees. Then I saw him again, closer this time. His smile was even wider, his eyes locked onto mine with a gleeful intensity. My breath hitched as he stepped from behind a tree, his fingers twitching, as if he could barely contain his excitement. I ran. My feet pounded the earth, branches clawing at my arms and face as I sprinted blindly through the woods. The sound of footsteps followed, unhurried but steady, a predator toying with its prey. The air grew thick, suffocating, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves clinging to my nostrils. My lungs burned, but I dared not stop. The trees blurred together, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal hands, as though the forest itself conspired to slow me down. I stumbled, nearly falling, but forced myself forward. The distant outline of a road came into view, a glimmer of salvation. My car was there, just a few hundred yards away. I reached for my keys, my fingers shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. Then I felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, grazing my shoulder. I let out a strangled scream and threw myself forward, wrenching open my car door and slamming it shut just as his face appeared in the window. That smile, unwavering, expectant. I fumbled with the keys, shoved them into the ignition, and roared onto the road, gravel spraying behind me. My chest heaved as I watched him in the rearview mirror. He didn't chase me. He didn't move, just stood there, smiling, watching. I drove for miles, barely able to breathe, checking the mirror every few seconds. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what had happened. Had he been real? Or had the isolation twisted my thoughts? But no matter how I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew the truth. When I got home, I locked every door, every window, triple-checked each one. But I knew it wouldn't matter, because somehow, deep in my gut, I knew this wasn't over. Somewhere, out there, he was still smiling, and he was waiting.